I have guest Craig Reid with me today, retired warrant officer in the PPCLI Light Infantry. I'd love to hear about you. Can you give us some insight to yourself and your position throughout the military over the years?
Well, I joined the military. I wanted to serve my country. I didn't want to end up pumping gas at Esso for the rest of my life. I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do when I finished high school, but right out of high school, I joined the military. My dad took me to Calgary. We applied at the recruiting center in Calgary, got the call, and I went to basic training in Cornwallis, Nova Scotia. I struggled in basic training. There was many times I wasn't sure if this was for me. When things got tough, I was like, what am I doing here? Graduated from basic training, and then I went to Wainwright for my infantry training, and that was 16 weeks. And I was fortunate, just through the help of my peers, I was the top candidate, top recruit on that course. So I won that award. Got posted to Calgary. I was in Calgary for 8 years, and then I went to Victoria for a year-long French course. That's where I met my wife in 1996. I slowly progressed, became a platoon 2IC, which is a warrant officer position with the 3rd Battalion. I got promoted, and essentially I ran a platoon. I was a platoon 2IC, so I had a platoon commander that I had to report to, but I had 30 to 35 soldiers under my command, and my job was to essentially make sure that they had all the things that they needed to do their jobs. I was responsible for their discipline, and obviously my job as a 2IC was to mold and train my platoon commander. Even though my platoon commander had, a lot less years of service than me, in the hierarchy he was my boss, but I was also there to advise him and make sure that he didn't overtrain my troops and guys end up getting hurt, etc. And I had tours of duty, minimum 6 months at a time. I did my first United Nations tour in Cyprus in 1991. I was just a young private. And then I went to Croatia in 1994. I was a master corporal on that tour. I went to Bosnia in 2000. I was a sergeant on that tour, and then ended with my tour in Afghanistan. And when I reflect back, it was an amazing experience. There were a lot of lows, but there were a lot of highs. And, I got a chance to travel and see the world, which was phenomenal for me. I had come from Medicine Hat and didn't really travel a lot within the country, but I was able to travel down to the United States and all over Europe. I saw Southwest Asia, and for that, it was just an amazing experience.
Yeah, that's amazing. I want to thank you for your service to start off. What was the initial draw to the military? Did your family have a history of military service, or just?
Yeah, my grandfather served in the Second World War. He was in Italy, did a lot of high-speed stuff, went to jail. He was a rebellious grandfather. He saw combat, and then my father joined the military. He was 16 when he joined. So I was the son of a military man, and I knew the way of life and the military way of life for my dad. It treated him extremely well. I was just a young kid, but I saw that the military was a good way of life. And when I finished high school, I didn't have very high marks. I knew if I applied for a college or university, I probably would get denied because my marks weren't good, because I didn't apply myself. It wasn't that I wasn't smart. It's just I was goofing off, and I was just being a young kid. And I did a lot of stupid stuff, and my marks just weren't high enough. So I thought, you know what, I could probably join the military. And again, the experience that my dad had, I knew that it was a phenomenal, he always talked about how much he loved it. And so once I got a little bit older, probably 13, 14, every time we'd drive to Cornwall, Ontario to see my grandfather before he passed away, my grandfather not once talked about the war. He didn't talk about the war unless he was drunk. But when he was sober, he didn't talk about it. And that's one life regret. I never had a chance to really talk to him about what it was like in the Second World War. I was just a young kid. So the attraction of the military, the structure was probably something I needed at that stage of my life. So that was, I just wanted to serve my country. I wanted to do something that no one on my street did, and that was join the military. And I just wanted the experience. Again, not knowing if I was cut out for it, but it was something, when I look back, I have absolutely no regrets for joining. It was a phenomenal experience.
I'd say you're cut out for it. You did 4 tours in different countries?
Yes.
So that's quite a lot of time. And you spent 20 years roughly in the military?
Yeah, just over 20 years.
Oh, wow. And that was the original pensionable time was 20 years, and it's 25 now?
Yeah, so when I joined, you had to serve a minimum of 20 years in order to become eligible for a full pension, and a pension that will follow you the rest of your life. There were many times when I was in Wainwright, 10 years in the military, I knew I had 10 more to go if I wanted to get my pension. There were a lot of nights I laid in a patrol base freezing because you can't move, and it would get cold. There were many nights I said to myself, like, what am I doing here? This doesn't seem right. I like, why am I here? What am I doing? And I would always constantly think of that. But it was just second nature. You were told to go to Wainwright, for example, to go on an exercise, and you're there. There was a lot of nights, again, that I thought, what am I doing here? I can't believe I'm doing this. I was really starting to second guess my life decisions, but you just put one foot in front of the other and soldier on, and next thing you know, it was time to retire.
Well, when you're thinking like that too, when you have your team with you, do you feel like you're there for the other guys too that are with you and girls?
Yes, 100%. I never, ever supervised females. We just didn't have a lot of females in the infantry battalions at that time. But having 35 guys under my command and knowing that the military trusted me to train these guys was extremely humbling for me. It was a huge responsibility. Not only did I have to get to know my platoon commander and find out where he's coming from up here, but I had 30 to 35 guys that I was responsible for. So I would have 3 section commanders that worked under me, and they were sergeants. And then master corporals were your section 2 ICs, and then you had 6 riflemen in each section. You had 3 sections in each platoon, and it was you identified very quickly who the strong ones were. But the biggest, and I had some soldiers that weren't nearly as effective and maybe as gifted as the others. So I would spend my time trying to bring them up to everybody else. And I would make sure I put, and I hate to use the term weaker soldiers, but the soldiers that weren't as strong, I made sure I put them in a section where I've got a strong section commander and a strong section 2 IC in order to bring their levels up. But it was an extremely, when I reflect back, it was one of the best jobs I had in the Army. It was a lot of responsibility. There were a lot of sleepless nights, but I had such a great bond with my platoon commander, and we had the same ideas on how to train our soldiers and how to become effective at the platoon level.
Yeah. So what you're doing, you're kind of like a coach then. Like when you were telling me, but evening out your lines. Like you can't have all the power in one line.
No.
Or your other groups are going to suffer.
That's right. And there's a saying in the military, especially at the platoon level, you're only as strong as your weakest man. So I always remembered that. It was taught to me when I was young, and I always wanted to make sure I structured my platoon so I had effective balance in all 3 sections. Sometimes personalities clash. I've worked with so many different types of personalities. But my job as a platoon 2 IC was to make sure I had that proper balance, and it was something I didn't take lightly. I would make decisions. Sometimes I would include my platoon commander. He's the more educated one. Like most of my platoon commanders I worked for, most of them had gone to RMC.
What's that? RMC?
The Royal Military College.
Okay.
So they went to university. There were all the platoon commanders in the infantry at that time were all university educated. 95% of them were outstanding men. Some took a little bit more time to mold. There were times I had some not fights, but just some verbal, not arguments either. Probably discussion is the best word. There were times I didn't agree with some of the ways that they wanted to train our troops, and my job was to make sure that my men were not just safe, but just physically fit. So if I've got guys with a bunch of shin splints and broken ankles and sprained ankles, they aren't able to deploy to the field. So I remember one time in particular, we had sent all our troops away for Christmas leave. Guys flew home to spend Christmas with their families. We came back to work the first Monday in January, and my platoon commander, I went to his office first thing in the morning, and I shook his hand, welcomed him, wished him a Happy New Year, all that stuff. And I said, "What do you want to do for PT today?" And he says, "Well, I think we're going to do a 15K run." And I looked at him and I said, "Oh, so you're going to do a 15-kilometer run?" No, the whole platoon's going to do a 15. No, sir. You're going to end up breaking guys. I have no doubt when you were home over Christmas vacation, I have no doubt that you trained every day, but I can assure you a lot of the troops, they were drinking, they weren't running. You're going to end up breaking a lot of my guys. And then I've got a sergeant major I'm responsible to, and if he says to me, "How come you've got 10 guys that can't deploy the field because they're broken? How did you allow this to happen?" So I would talk to my platoon commander, and we would come to a mutual decision. Okay, maybe we'll just do a 5-kilometer light run, but we'll do some circuit training involved. We'll do some push-ups and sit-ups. So we would compromise, because again, I got to look out for the 30 guys that are under my command.
Yeah. To get to your position, what kind of training did you have to go through to get there? Did you have to go to the college too, or did you just get sent on the field, or they just saw the potential in you and just said, "Hey," or did you have to apply?
No, the way it works in the military, we have what's called personal evaluation reports. They're called PERs. And your platoon commander, for example, would write me up once a year, and they basically evaluate you. So you needed 3 superior graded PERs to be considered for a career course. And outside the battalion, we had a career manager, which was a chief warrant officer position in Ottawa, and you would be merited by your performance. So it wasn't necessarily something we had to apply for. I would obviously tell my platoon commander, "Listen, I'm interested in moving up, but your performance evaluation reports are what gets you promoted." So in order to get promoted in the infantry, you had to go to Gagetown to do what's called the first course was in Wainwright, and it was an infantry section commander course. And your infantry section commander course was 16 weeks long, and it was very arduous, very intense, but they taught you how to lead. They taught you how to instruct in a classroom. They taught you how to instruct in the field. And when you're doing field fire exercises, when you're doing raids and ambushes, you're essentially at the corporal level. But those courses would help you get promoted. So the infantry section commander course, I did very well. I finished in the top third. When you go on these courses, it's essentially they get broken up into tiers. So there's upper third, middle third, lower third, and I finished in the upper third, and I got promoted to master corporal after that course. And then a few years later, once I got superior PERs, because if your performance was rated as average or satisfactory, you probably aren't going to go on a career course. But if your performance was rated to be superior or outstanding, those guys were selected for the next career course. So the next career course I had to go on in the infantry was your small arms instructor course, and that course was in Gagetown. I went there in 1995 on my small arms instructor course. And they essentially they teach you how to run ranges, military ranges. So all your machine guns, your grenades, your rocket launchers, your M203s, your C6, your C9, and you would run ranges. And you would one man would be appointed as the range safety officer. Then that range safety officer would always have a 2IC, and you would be rated on your performance about how to run a range in accordance with the Canadian Forces standards. That was a very, very challenging course as well. I finished in the middle third this time because I did fail one of my tests. I ran a range and I failed a test, so you had to do a retest. I passed my retest and eventually passed the course. then came back to battalion, and then it was time to go on your 6B. And the 6B was your course that you needed to get promoted to warrant officer. And that was a very challenging course. It was hard. It was, you were constantly for 3.5 months, you're constantly wet, you're cold, you're tired, you're hungry. You would deploy to the field on a Monday morning and you wouldn't come back till Friday afternoon. And each night that you were in the field, they would purposely deprive you of sleep because they want to see how you perform. There's no sleep deprivation training per se in the military, but those career courses, they would deprive you of sleep because they want to see how you perform. Because when you go on an exercise or you get deployed overseas, there are a lot of nights you're not going to have a lot of sleep. So you have a responsibility. Everybody reacts differently to a lack of sleep. And for me, I hallucinate. That's one thing I do. Some other guys, they can sleep standing up. I can't sleep standing up. But some guys would the sleep deprivation would be to a point where, we would be lying in a patrol base and I would be looking out and I'd be watching my arcs, and there'd be times like a white picket fence would appear. And one time I hit my buddy beside me and I kind of whispered to him. I said, "What do you see out there?" And he said, "Well, I just see nothing but trees." "No, do you see the fence?" He looked at me. "What fence?" So that's how I knew I was starting to hallucinate, and that's how sleep deprivation training. That's how I know I'm seriously deprived of sleep. Is I start hallucinating, and guys do different things when they're sleep deprived. It's funny to watch how guys react, but at the end of the day, when you're on these career courses, you're there for one another, and you're there for each other. You're there to pick each other up. And when I was on these career courses, you're always there to help. And one thing I was very strong at was navigation. And we didn't have GPSs back in the 90s and the early 2000s, even the late 80s. We didn't have GPSs. We actually had to use a map and compass, and you would be trained on how to read a map and how reading that map, how it looks on the field. So I was very strong at navigation. I wasn't as strong, say, like I wasn't the most physically fit guy in the section, but I would always help whoever was in the breach, whoever was getting assessed. I would help him with his navigation. And there was a lot of times they would do the pre-planning, the reconnaissance for doing a navigation from point A to point B. It could be 8 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 12 kilometers. Then you've got all this gear that you've got on your backs. You've got your weapon, you've got your helmet on your head, and you'd have to deploy from point A to point B. So I always helped out my peers because my peers knew I was good at navigation, and so it was always good to help out because you're there for each other. You don't want to see a guy burn on his own. You don't want to see a guy fail a class or fail a course. So you're there to pick each other up and encourage each other. So I find as I got through the military and as the years went on, I became a better leader because I learned from the best guys I trained with, and I would always take a really good leadership skill from one guy, and I'd say to myself, you know what, if I could be like that, you know what, my job will be easy. So it was picking the personality traits and the leadership traits from certain people, and you mold them into your own. And that's how you become a good leader. And you become a good leader by making mistakes. By all means, I'm not perfect. I was never perfect. But the one thing that I always strove is if I made a mistake, I would be the first guy to put up my hand and say, hey, that was me. That was my fault. And when you're accountable for your actions and your team knows you're accountable for your actions, people respect you and people want to work with you. If you make a mistake and you don't own up to it and you try to hide because you don't want your mistake to be exposed to your platoon, it creates a negative environment within your platoon. So I always strove to lead by example. I always led from the front. And when you make a mistake, the big thing is admit it. Because, again, we're all humans. We all make mistakes.
I really like that. And like you said, lead from the front. Something I was reading about Julius Caesar, he would march with his troops. And they really respected him and loved him for that. And another thing about being a leader that you said is you didn't want to leave any man behind to fail courses. you were looking out for people, and that's good leadership skills. You want to make everyone uplift people. They want to see the weakest guy become one of the strongest guys.
Yeah, I took a lot of pride in helping out the younger guys who maybe weren't as strong, because again, as a sergeant and a guy in a platoon 2IC role, you don't want to see guys fail, because if a guy in your platoon fails, I think in a lot of cases it's an indictment on you. And I never wanted to see guys fail. I always wanted, if guys were struggling, I would always pull them aside and talk to them and encourage them, because again, there's nothing. I once had a platoon warrant officer I worked for way back when I first started, and his name was Monkey McNeil. And Monkey was a guy that I absolutely hated when I first met him, and once I got to know him, he turned out to be one of the best warrant officers that I ever worked for. So I tried to mold my style after him, because I know how it affected me as a young man. Sometimes you've got sergeants and warrant officers, sergeant majors, who were not very good, and sometimes I would look at them and say to myself, man, if I ever get to be to that rank level, I don't want to end up like him, because I remember the negative effect it had on me. And I always thought, and still believe to this day, your staff, your soldiers deserve a great leader. They deserve to be led by a strong leader. And, I wasn't the best leader, but I know I always led from the front and always had the genuine interests of every single man under my command at bay. I always wanted to make sure everybody was taken care of and looked after.
Yeah, just hearing your story that you told me, I can see that you really did have that quality in yourself. You really did care about your guys, and they meant a lot to you, and being a leader was really important to you as well. So can you explain to me September 11th 2001, what does that mean for you and your guys and you in the military? What did you ended up in Afghanistan, and that was a very serious time in the world.
September 11th 2001 is one of those days. It's one of those days that you know what you were doing when you heard what had happened in New York and Washington and in that field in Pennsylvania.
1 second for our younger viewers. Most of us know, but those are terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. And sorry to cut you off.
No.
Some people might not know. I'm sure most of us do, but there are some people listening who might be younger.
That's fair. It's one of those world events that you know exactly what you were doing, where you were when those planes hit that trade center. And we were here in Edmonton. I had taken my platoon for a run. My platoon commander was away on a course, so I was filling in and acting as a platoon commander. So I had taken my troops for a run. It was probably 5 to 10 kilometers long. And then every once in a while we would stop, do push-ups, do some sit-ups, do some burpees, and then we made our way back. And then once we made our way back into the battalion headquarters, it was probably about 8:30, 8:45. And I remember when we were coming back from PT, walking into the building, and we had a battalion orderly sergeant's desk. The battalion orderly sergeant's desk was right at the entrance of the building. And I remember seeing about, there must have been 50, maybe 75 guys huddled around a TV. And the TV that they had in that office was very small. It was probably only a 20, maybe 24-inch TV. And I remember seeing all these guys looking at the TV, and guys were watching, and guys were saying, Jesus Christ, I can't believe that happened. So I had just come back. I had no knowledge of what was going on. So, and of course I'm not tall, so I'm trying to peek over people, trying to see what was going on. And I could see the planes going into the World Trade Center, and they kept showing it and kept showing it. So I thought nothing of it at the time, and I thought, wow, that's bizarre. So we went and had our showers and changed back into our uniforms, and then it was just a couple of days later we got the warning order from the United States that they requested an infantry battalion to assist them because they were going to go over to Afghanistan. So the 3rd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry got the warning order. We were going to go and support the United States in Afghanistan. And I think we got the warning order, it was probably late October So it was a little while after. But I remember going home and watching the coverage on TV, and I remember just thinking, it was unfathomable. I had never seen anything like that in my life. So when we got the warning order to go, we knew that we were going to go over to Afghanistan. It wasn't going to happen until the following year. So it was in late January or mid-January, once we got back from Christmas vacation, that we knew we were going over there. So we started training. We started making sure everybody was up to date on their personal weapons test. We had to make sure we had all the regular, all the immunizations in order to go over there. And it was surreal. It was exciting because this is what you train your entire life for, is to go, and the infantry's role is to close with and destroy the enemy. And you train for that. You train for that every single day that you're in the military, especially in the infantry. But to know that you're going to be going on a plane in a very short amount of time to go over was a little scary, and I was a little apprehensive, but I was also very confident in my skills. I was confident in the men that we worked with that we were going to do well. I had no idea at the time what we were actually going to do in Afghanistan. It wasn't only until after we got there I realized what our daily life was going to be. But it was surreal. It was exciting, like, at the same time. But I knew I'd be leaving my wife. I didn't like the idea of leaving my wife behind, but she knew when we got married in 2000. She knew what she was getting herself into, and unfortunately, I spent some time away. But that's just the life in the military. You're away from your families a lot, and that's part of the infantry way of life. I didn't care for. I didn't like being away from my family. My family is incredibly supportive of me, and I'm very appreciative of the family that I have. And but 9/11 is one of those things. Again, you'll always remember where you were when those planes struck the Trade Center. But to get told that you're going to Afghanistan, because our battalion was the immediate reaction unit for the brigade, and it was exciting.
I couldn't imagine just the feeling of me knowing the anticipation, the buildup, waiting to go, and then you on the plane there, just what's going through your mind, like worrying about this, or am I gonna make it home? Like, not everyone does make it home. And you'd already served in overseas at three separate times at this point.
That's right.
Okay, so then all this happens, and then you get to Afghanistan. So what were you guys doing there? Like, what all was happening? I was a young kid at this time, and I'm just trying to figure out, like, what were you guys doing? Like, were you on these missions? Did you find Osama bin Laden? Like, because he eventually did get apprehended, but you were also part of in that area, man. It's so interesting.
It was an experience that I reflect back on, and I'm incredibly grateful I had the opportunity to serve my country in that capacity. The one thing I remember the most about landing there was when we left Edmonton. It was about -20. It was very cold. We got on the aircraft, and the aircraft took us to Frankfurt, Germany. And once we landed in Germany, we got onto another plane, a combat plane, that flew us into Kandahar. And we flew right into Kandahar, and I remember we landed there. It was in the middle of the afternoon, and I remember thinking, geez, is it going to be freezing there? Is it going to be warm? Like, we weren't sure. But when that ramp of that aircraft, once the aircraft stopped and that ramp dropped, there was just a blast of heat that you walked into when you were disembarking off that aircraft, and it was very, very warm. It was mid-20s. It was about 25 degrees Celsius. It was in mid-February when we got there, or maybe it was about mid-February, beginning of February when we landed. And it was just that wall of heat from the desert, because Kandahar is in a desert. And once the ramp went down, we went to our camp. Our camp was right on the Kandahar airfield. We essentially had set up 2-man reconnaissance tents, and that's what we slept in. We had a cot, and I had an air mattress that was maybe 2 inches thick, and that's what we slept on. And of course, during the day, inside your tent, it's hot. It's very hot. We didn't have air-conditioned buildings to live in. We literally lived in a tent, and all these tents were all situated all together and each rifle company had 130 guys. So you had to have, 65 tents to house everyone. And it was, we had some modular tenting, which was a little bit bigger tents. Guys slept in those. They were very warm during the day. At night, it would get pretty chilly. Like if you left a glass of water out, it would be frozen in the morning. Like not frozen solid, but the top would be frozen. And I remember when we landed in Afghanistan, we were cohabitating with the 101st Airborne Regiment, and I know there were some elements of 10 Mountain Div and 82nd Airborne Regiment that were at the Kandahar airfield. So we were really close located with the American military, and it was surreal. Initially, we were doing some patrols. We had essentially, it was like a wire around the camp, and that wire was patrolled 24/7. And sometimes what the Al-Qaeda would do, because they knew we were there, and sometimes what the Al-Qaeda would do is they would launch rockets into our camp, usually in the middle of the night. So we used to do drills on how to combat that. We had trenches that were dug into the ground that we could go into for safety, but we had that outside, that wire was patrolled 24/7. We had guys sitting in bunkers, awake, watching for imminent threats. But the big threat, sometimes the Al-Qaeda would come close to our wire and just shoot rifles. They would have their rifles and they would shoot bullets into our camp. It didn't happen a lot during the day because obviously during the day when you've got a lot of sunlight, you were able to see them coming. At nighttime is a little bit harder. We did have night vision devices that we were able to see. But we did patrols with the American military, and we did some training down in Tarnak Farms. Tarnak Farms was an Al-Qaeda training facility that was run by Osama bin Laden. It was approximately from what I remember, 6 to 7 kilometers. I could be a little bit wrong, but it was about 6 to 7 kilometers away from the Kandahar airfield. So we would do some training down there. We would do some rifle training, but all of it was gearing up for some of the missions that we did. And the first mission that we did was Operation Harpoon, Operation Anaconda, and that was run over my birthday. I always remember I spent my birthday out on this mountain. And so what had happened was there was a structure, a mountain range called the Whale. So when you looked at the Whale from above, when you looked down, it looked like a whale. The mountain range looked like a whale from up above. That's why they called it the Whale. So we deployed to the Whale. We initially what had happened was we flew by aircraft up to Bagram Air Base. The Bagram Air Base was a couple hundred kilometers north of Kandahar Airfield, and the Bagram Air Base was again run by the Americans. It was a big air base. They had tons and tons of aircraft, high-speed vehicles, weapons, and we went up there to train with the Americans. And when we got deployed to the Whale, we were up in Bagram for a few days, and then we got onto Chinook helicopters. So we got onto Chinook helicopters, and I remember before we deployed, we had done a set of orders. We had done a set of orders, and for the first time in my career, the mission was to close with and destroy any Al-Qaeda insurgents that we saw there. And I remember a chill running up and down my spine, thinking, we're actually going to do this. Like it was exciting. It was terrifying at the same time, but it was exciting. And you're there with everybody. Yeah. Was there a chance that some of us, like what happens if that aircraft got shot down? Those were things in my mind. But you can't live your day-to-day life thinking, what if this happens? What if that happens? You just got to go and do your job and hope for the best. So when we got on those Chinook helicopters, they flew us onto the Whale. And I remember when the helicopters had done a tactical landing, so the back of the aircraft would open up and you would literally pour out of that aircraft, because that aircraft is only on the ground for about 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds, and then they got to get out of there because the intelligence reports that we had received from our battalion headquarters was that there were insurgents on that Whale. The Whale was full of caves, and we didn't know how many enemy forces were there, but our job was to go onto the Whale, and destroy anything that we saw in concert with our rules of engagement that we had. You can't just start opening fire if you see something in the distance. You have to identify it to make sure it's actually enemy forces and not friendly. So to be on that whale and to be 10,000 feet above sea level during the day, we had so much equipment that we had to lug around. Your rucksack weighed 60, 70, 80, sometimes 90 pounds. You're carrying batteries for your radios. You're carrying all your ammunition. You're carrying liters of water, because without water, you can't survive. So we would carry all our rations on there. And you threw a pair of socks in there. You weren't worried about having a change of clothes because you were going to sweat. But it was far more important to have ammunition and water and rations versus having an extra uniform. So I would leave my extra uniform behind because I knew that the mission was only going to be a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, but it was okay. I could still wear the same uniform. Yeah, we probably were quite ripe, in terms of our smell, because we all had BO, I'm sure of it, but you don't smell it because everybody smells the same. But to deploy on the whale and to do advance to contact on the whale, moving together in search of enemy insurgents, was a phenomenal experience.
During these operations, is it hard to keep the morality up with the troops?
Morale was definitely challenging at times, given some of the guys that worked for me. Some felt that they figured or had a premonition that their time was up and they couldn't deploy. And I would always tell these guys, listen, I'm going to deploy. My time could be tomorrow, could be today, could be a year from now. We don't know, but we have an obligation. We signed the dotted line to serve our country, and we have an obligation to serve our country. So I would tell my guys, the guys that didn't want to deploy, I would tell them, I'm scared too. I'm fearful. I don't want to die here, but I led from the front, and I wanted them to come with me. And just to let them know that I felt the same sentiments as them, made them, and I think some were inspired. Okay, this, my platoon 2IC wants to go, so we're going to go. But in terms of morale, it was some guys had a hard time with it. And again, it's all about knowing your people, knowing your staff, knowing your soldiers. Once you know them, you know what triggers them. You know how to get the most out of them. So I would do the best I could to keep the morale up, because we would always joke, hey, we've only got 174 days in theater. It's okay, and no one wants to hear that you got 5 more months in this country, because Afghanistan was, at that time, was, one of the armpits of the world. But that's our job.
Yeah. You also, you told me about a pretty intense story that, are you okay sharing this?
Yes.
What happened with it's Tarnack Farms incident?
That's right.
And a little bit of survivor's guilt that happened there?
Yes.
I don't know if you're willing to take the wheel here and kind of tell us what happened and the incidents surrounding this incident, what led to this, looking back, I don't know how frustrated you were with the decisions that were made by superiors. So going back to the April 17th, 2002, can you just let the viewers know about all this? And
well, I've when I look back at my military service, that was the worst day of my life, without question. I was the ops, or the operations warrant / ops sergeant for the parachute company on that tour. My immediate supervisor was a gentleman by the name of Major Sean Hackett. Sean was RMC educated, very smart man. So he was my boss, and he was very demanding. He was hard to work for. When I worked for somebody in the military, once I got to know them, I would always try and anticipate what my future tasks might be. He was very difficult to read. So on April 17th in the morning, we had an O group. And what an O group is, it's an orders group. And in a rifle company, Your company commander would be the head of the O group, the senior ranking officer. You would have a captain who would be his 2IC. You'd have the sergeant major of the rifle company. You'd have 3 platoon commanders, 3 platoon warrants, and you'd have your company signaler. They would all be part of your orders group. So the orders group was, we had the O group in the morning, and later on in the late afternoon, early evening, we would be deploying to Tarnack Farms to do some live fire training. That would take minimum a couple hours to do. And as the operations warrant for the para company, I was tasked with doing a lot of reports for my company commander, Major Hackett. At the time, I just wanted to do my job really well. I strived to do my job well. I had no operations experience prior to being tasked as the operations guy for the company. I told Sean Hackett I had some reservations, but he put his arm around me and said, "I know I've got the right man for the job. You're going to do well." And I remember at times in Afghanistan going to see a master warrant officer by the name of Gil Payette. And Gil had a lot of operational experience, and Gil was one of my mentors. I went and talked to Gil, sought some advice from Gil. He would teach me things, show me the ropes, so to speak, when it came to operations. So on the 17th, I was tasked to go. To the range. I was going to be one of the range safety officers. Major Hackett and Captain Joe Jasper were going to be the RSOs, the range safety officers, and my job, was the assistant range safety officer, which were all sergeants and warrant officers. And I was tasked to go that night. And I still had a lot of paperwork that I had to do, and that paperwork would go to Sean Hackett. He would give the check mark, the thumbs up. Okay, this report's good. This report needs work. And again, I was trying my best at the time to anticipate what he wanted, but he was very, very challenging to work for. There were times I hated him. There were times I despised him. And then there was other days I loved him. And it was, I approached him after the O group, and we were just standing outside the observation, it was just a small modular tent where we had, I think, 2 or 3 6-foot tables and chairs, and we did our orders group right inside that tent. And after we had the O group, I approached Major Hackett and I said, you tasked me to go to the range? He said, yes. And I said, well, can the reports that you want me to do later on today, I said, can they wait? And he said, no. And I said, well, how do you want me to do this? I can't put 10 pounds of garbage into a 5-pound bag. Like, what do you want me to do? Either I go to the range or I stay behind and I do this paperwork that you insist has to be done. And it's got to be done by the time you get back. And bringing a laptop out to the range wasn't feasible. So I asked him what he wanted. And we were kind of semi-arguing at that point. And he said to me, and I remember just kind of looking over my shoulder, and I remember seeing Sergeant Marc Leger was walking close to where we were talking. And he just looked, Major Hackett looked at me and he said, well, listen, if you can't go, find a replacement. So he turned and walked away. I was pissed off. Mark came over to me and he said, what's going on? And I said, well, Major Hackett wants me to go to the range, but I got to do all this shitty paperwork, and I wasn't happy about it. But he wants me to stay behind and do this paperwork, and I didn't think it was fair. And Mark said, well, listen, I'm not going to the range tonight. What if I just go in your spot? And I looked at him and I said, well, you don't have to do that. And he goes, no. He says, it'll be good for me because I'm not going to the range tonight. It'll be good for me to get out with the guys with this live fire exercise, and it'll be good for me. Like, I want to get out of the camp. I don't want to sit here. So I looked at Mark and I said, well, I'll tell you what. When we get to Dubai, we were scheduled to go to Dubai for our R&R for 4 days. And it was towards, I think, the end of April or maybe the beginning of May. Actually, it was beginning of May. I said, listen, we'll when we go to Dubai, I said, I will buy you a few beers for doing this for me.
What's R&R?
It was just rest and relaxation.
Okay.
R&R, they had We only had one block. We only had 4 days off in this 7-month deployment to Afghanistan. It was 4 days that we spent in Dubai. Rest and relaxation was R&R. And myself and Mark Leger were on the same flight to go to Dubai for this R&R stint. So Mark agreed to go to the range for me. I didn't understand at the time. The paperwork certainly could have waited, and I pleaded with Major Hackett. I said, well, this can probably wait. And he said, no, it can't wait. And it's not going to wait. You're going to get this done because when I get back from the range, I need to go over it, sign it off, and then my job was to take all those reports to the battalion headquarters building and drop, or the battalion, it was a big tent, but to drop them off so the CO could review them. So just after supper, probably around 7 in the evening, 6 or 7 in the evening, the boys got on all the trucks and they deployed to the range. And they deployed to the range, and as darkness fell, I was in the command post where we had our orders groups. I was in the command post. I was hooked up to the intranet, and I was doing all the reports and the returns. It took me hours. It took me hours to do, and it was probably around midnight. I was still up, still doing these reports and returns. At the time, there was about maybe 20 guys from our rifle company that stayed behind, that did not go to the range. About 20 guys, roughly, give or take. And I remember hearing all the aircraft above me. And of course, it's pitch black. I'm looking up, and I can't see them, but I can hear them. And, when you've got fighter jets in the air and you're in Afghanistan, it's normal. So I didn't think anything of it. I'm continuing to work. I'm just getting ready to wind down. It's about 1:30 in the morning on the 18th of April, and all of a sudden, again, still hearing the aircraft above, and then all of a sudden I hear a kaboom, this humongous blast, and it shook my tent. It shook me, and I thought to myself, what the heck is that? That seemed like it was awfully close. And then the fighter jets, I could hear them flying away, and it was peaceful. It was quiet. So I remember sitting back in the chair, and again, after I heard that blast, I didn't know what it was. And I remember sitting back in the chair. I finally had all my reports done. It literally had taken me hours to do. I reviewed them. I made sure that they were good. They were at least to the best of my ability, and they were all ready for Major Hackett to review. And then I was in the command post. They had a bench in there and an air mattress on the bench, and I just laid back and I closed my eyes. And I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember, it was about 3:30, 4 o'clock, and Major Shane Schreiber shows up. And Major Shane Schreiber used to be in Major Hackett's shoes. He used to be the company commander for the parachute company. And I had a really good rapport with Shane. Shane was an outstanding officer. He was an outstanding company commander. I admired him. And he came to the command post and saw me laying there, so he woke me. And he said, how many guys stayed back from the range? And I said, I don't know, like maybe 20 of us. And he said, listen, I need you to go to all the tents. And again, this is 4 o'clock in the morning. It's pitch black. He said, I need you to go wake everybody up and bring them here. And his voice kind of trembled. And I said, well, what do you mean you want me to go get everybody? He says, there's been an incident. 4 men in this company are dead. I need you to go wake everybody up. And I remember, just trembling a little bit, thinking, oh, for Christ's sakes. I didn't want to go, but I knew I had to go. So I grabbed a flashlight and I went to all the tents where everybody was sleeping, and I was going from tent to tent, and I'm waking guys up, and guys are waking up. What are you doing? Get away. Go away. I'm trying to sleep. And I said, listen, there's been an incident. You need to come to the command post. Come to the command post. And I would go from tent to tent to tent with my flashlight, waking guys up. And I remember when I was going from tent to tent, I was thinking, Jesus Christ, it better not be Mark. It better not be Mark. That's all I cared about, because Mark replaced me. So I woke everybody up. We all, slowly but surely, everybody woke up. threw their boots on. We all made it to the command post, and all the men were there. And Shane Schreiber was standing at the front, and he sat us all down. He said, "What I have to say is not easy," but he said, 4 men in this company are dead. And he pulled out a piece of paper, and he read off the names. The first name he read was Mark. And it was sobering. I was, after he read Mark's name, I don't know what other names he read, because all that was going through my head, I was trying to process, the man that just replaced me on the range hours earlier is now gone. And I was scared, I was angry, I was frustrated, and I remember leaving the tent, and I remember collapsing on my knees, and I must have been punching at the gravel on the ground, because a couple of guys had got a hold of me and stood me up, and I looked at my hands, and they were all bloody. My knuckles were bloody, and I just couldn't believe it. And I walked over to Shane Schreiber, he was still there, and I said, "Do you know what happened?" And he said, "A fighter jet dropped a 500-pound bomb on the rifle company out there." And I said, "Well, when can we go?" He says, "You're not going anywhere." I said, No, I want to go. Like, we need to go and help in any way we can. And so you fast forward a couple of hours, and daylight started to come. It was about 6 a.m, I think, roughly. And some of the rifle company guys from our guys started arriving back. And I remember looking at the faces of the men that were getting off the trucks, and it was awful to see, because you could see the pain in their eyes. And I just hugged each of them as they got off the truck. And then there was another truck that left a little like an hour later that went back out there. So I made sure I got on that truck. And when I walked out there, I saw lots of chem lights, and chem lights are those fluorescent lights that you can break in half, that you don't actually break them in half, but you just break them slightly and they illuminate. And I didn't know it at the time, but all the miniature flags and the chem lights were all the body parts that were in Tarnack Farms where the bombing happened. And by the time we got out there, the bodies had been the bodies of our fallen had been taken away. And I remember just it was awful. It was awful. It was without question the worst night in my career. But at the same time, I realized I dodged a bullet. And they always say it. You never know when it's going to be your time to go. And I'm not a religious person at all, but Almighty God was looking out for me that day. And unfortunately, one of my peers, a man that I trained in the infantry school in Wainwright, is now dead. And I remember just absolute sadness, and I was angry. I was angry because I just had heard that this was a friendly fire incident. Friendly fire incidents are not supposed to happen. Why is a major dropping a 500-pound bomb on our troops? We were friendlies. We were working with these guys. And at the time, I remember thinking, this can't happen. This hasn't happened. And I was in denial. And I tried to talk to a couple of my peers about it. And I was crying. I thought at that time, I don't know if I could finish this tour. I didn't know if I had the mental, not capacity, but just there was so much going on in my brain. I didn't know if I could do my job. And Major Hackett had a chat with me. And I looked at him and I said, you saved my life. Like, you could have easily said, yeah, the paperwork can wait. We'll do it tomorrow. And had he done that, I wouldn't be here.
All the different thoughts must have been running through your mind. And then, it's not your fault. You were told to stay behind to do this. And then, how do you recover from something like this? Everything.
It was really hard. It was incredibly difficult. I don't know how I recovered. I mean, I talked to my peers, I talked with the guys that were out there. The guys in my company knew the story at that time that I was supposed to go, and Mark volunteered to go in my spot. Every day, military life and certainly life in the infantry teaches you to put one foot in front of the other and just soldier on. I knew what had happened is something that I knew at that time was probably, I don't know if it could have gotten any worse other than the fact that I could have been killed. So talking with my peers helped. They brought in a few chaplains to talk to us, but a lot of us didn't want to, talk to the chaplains because chaplains weren't out there. The chaplains don't do our job. How are they going to understand what we're going through up here? And Major Hackett must have noticed that I was lagging a bit mentally, and he had a chat with me probably a couple of days afterwards, and he told me not to let this bother me. And I looked at him. I said, how can this not bother me? Now I feel immense guilt because another man just died because he volunteered to go. And I could have told him, no, I'm going to go. Major Hackett could have decided I'm going to go, going to stay back. Or what if he said, you're going to the range? I'm going to the range, and I would have gone. So to answer your question, it was very, very challenging mentally, but talking with my peers helped. Expressing my anger towards my commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Pat Strogren was the battalion commander, and Pat and I had worked together a lot over the years. I didn't care for him when I first met him, but I thought as a battalion commander, I thought he did an immense job, did a great job. And I told Lieutenant Colonel Strogren that, because he asked me one morning when I was dropping off paperwork at the battalion headquarters, he put his arm around me and he said, "How you doing?" And I looked at him, I said, "I'm not doing good. I am not doing good." And he goes, "No, you shouldn't be doing good. But we're here for you. I'm here for you. We're here for one another. We got to get through this." And I remembered at that time, Gil Payette came to see me. And Gil, same thing, put his arm around me and said, this isn't on you. You were just doing what you were told to do. And we're going to get through this. And so it was just talking with some of my mentors. It was talking with my peers. And obviously the troops that I was leading, I couldn't abandon them. They were hurting just as much as I was. So I would talk to my troops and sit and cry with my soldiers. And I felt no shame in crying with my soldiers because I'm a human being too. I might be their boss, but I'm still human. Yeah. And over the course of the next few days and weeks, we still had more operations that we had to do. You just got to put one foot in front of the other. And I remembered at that time that, I can do this. I can get through this. I'm going to get through this. And ultimately we did.
And then returning to civilian life, and the Army helped you while you were out? Like when you returned from Afghanistan after all this, you were offered supports. Did they have you take therapy sessions? Did they make sure you were okay? Because a lot of people suffer once they leave the military, and they just kind of, you hear the horror stories of guys just suffering in silence, and we all know like the statistics surrounding military people, and some of them aren't good.
No, you're right. And the problem back in 2002 was, like just before we left Afghanistan, I remember distinctly. I remember an American pilot walked past me, and I was on my way to the battalion headquarters to drop off more paperwork. And I remember walking past him, and this was very shortly after the bombing. And I held a little bit of anger towards American forces at that time based on what had happened. Not only did Sergeant Mark Leger died, but Corporal Ainsworth Dyer, Private Richard Green, Private Nathan Smith. Smith and Green I trained in Wainwright. I knew them very, very well, and they were really, really good kids. And I call them kids because I was 25 or 20 years older than they were. And Ainsworth Dyer was one of the most phenomenal human beings I've ever met in my life. A young guy, boisterous. He was just a great guy, hard worker, a pleasure, just an absolute pleasure to lead. And I remember walking past this American this American pilot, and I remember thinking in my head, you know what? These guys drew first blood, not us. Now it's us against them. But then the more time I thought about it, I realized, you know what? It's not us against them. We are here together. And this American fighter pilot shook my hand and apologized. He said, "I'm so sorry what happened." And I mean, how could I be mad at him? It wasn't his fault. He wasn't flying the aircraft. So it created some tension initially, you know, that an American fighter pilot dropped this bomb and killed 4 Canadian soldiers who were living in the same camp with the Americans. It was there was some anger there. Over time, that dissipated. Coming home was hard. Coming home was, I mean, I was happy. You know, we had gone and done 3 incredibly mentally taxing missions, working with the American forces. Coming home, I thought I was normal. I didn't think anything was different about me. I remember when the aircraft took off, like we were on the aircraft to fly back to Canada, and I remember when the aircraft wheels got off the tarmac, I remember I started to cry, because I knew in my heart I was just grateful to be alive. It made me appreciate my life more. When we got home, we were off for 2 months. We were off on vacation for 2 months because of the fact that we were over there. We had 4 days off in the 7 months that we were over there. And, you know, we had some downtime over there, sure, but in the camp, you weren't able to leave. When we got back to Canada, there were some support systems available to us. I didn't ask for any help because I didn't think I was hurting. Sure, I was still living with the guilt over Mark, but at the same time, I still had soldiers to lead, and I wanted to make sure that my troops were good. I wanted to make sure that my relationship with my platoon commander was good, and we had a great rapport. Major Hackett, I had some anger towards him because of the fact that, you know, Mark's gone. We obviously were overseas. We didn't have an opportunity to attend their funerals, and it wasn't until we got back that I realized, you know what, I'm good. I don't want to go get help either, because there was a big stigma in 2002, and if you went and sought help, you were looked at as a pussy. You were looked at as weak. And how can you abandon your troops and go get help for yourself? Who's going to lead your troops? So I felt an obligation to stay behind and look after my troops instead of going and getting help for myself. I didn't think I was hurting. I was hurting, but I thought I was still normal. And after 2002, I remembered going to see Gil Payette, and I bought him. Gil Payette was at that time probably in his early 40s, and Gil only had one lung. He had lung cancer and lost one of his lungs, and he was still smoking, and he was a drinker. And I bought a 40 of Crown Royal for him, and before we all went on vacation, I went to see him in his office here in Edmonton, and I gave it to him as I said, "You helped me a lot. You helped me grow as a leader. You taught me a lot of things. You didn't have to, but you did." So I gave a 40 of Crown Royal to him. And this was probably 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. And he looks at me and he says, "Close the door." So I closed the door, and he undid the lid, and he poured each of us a glass. And he said to Mark, Ainsworth, Richard, Nathan, to the fallen. And I'm not a Crown Royal drinker, but I sucked it back. And it was an immense moment for me. And unfortunately, a couple years later, Gil Payette passed away. So there's another one of my mentors gone. But the stigma of post-traumatic stress was very real. You didn't volunteer to go get help because, again, you were looked at as weak. And we're supposed to be tough infantry paratroopers, some of the most physically fit men in the battalion. How can I go get help? Who's going to lead my troops? So it wasn't until after Afghanistan, the following spring, I got posted to Ottawa. And my wife and I at that time, after we got back from Afghanistan, were expecting our first child. And having the prospect of being a father is the most amazing thing in the world. The most important job in the world is being a dad. And my wife actually talked to me and said, you know what? I think you need to go see somebody. And I kind of put it off. No, I'm fine. No, you're not fine. She noticed a big change in me when I got home. So it wasn't until she told me I should go and get some help, I went and got some help. And I went and saw a military psychologist, a military psychiatrist. I sat down with them, and over the course of weeks and months, I had some therapy. They put me on some medication because I was having nightmares. I would wake up in the middle of the night and I could smell the cordite from Tarnack Farms. And I would wake up sometimes in a sweat, and I would think about the boys. I would think about Mark, and that whole conversation with Major Hackett would replay in my head. And sometimes I wished I would have said something different so that Major Hackett could say, no, you can come to the range. Yeah. What if I just said, sir, the paperwork can wait? Then I could have gone to the range. Yeah, I wouldn't be here anymore, but then I wouldn't have to live with this guilt. And that's what was going on in my head. So it was weeks and months of therapy. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, which part of it, the survivor's guilt. The survivor's guilt that, was very real to me. And one of the November 11th ceremonies in Ottawa that I attended, I was in my full dress uniform, and I knew that Mark was laid to rest in Lancaster, Ontario, which was about an hour away from Ottawa. So on this one November 11th, I went by myself. I was in my car, and I left Ottawa after the service in the morning, and I drove to Lancaster, and I didn't know where the cemetery was, and it was in the middle. It was probably early afternoon by the time I got there, and I don't remember if it was 2003, 2004, 2005. I think it was 03 or 04. I'm not 100% sure. But I was in my military uniform, and I remember coming up to a four-way stop. And Lancaster is a small town. It's right on the 401 highway, and it's just northeast of Cornwall. And I remember pulling up to a four-way stop, and I saw some guy standing on the corner. He was waiting to cross, and I rolled down my window, and I yelled at him, and I said, do you know where the cemetery is? And he obviously saw the uniform, and he goes, he gave me directions on how to get there. And I said, I'm looking for Sergeant Mark Leger's gravesite. And he said, oh, Sergeant Leger, he's a hero. And I said, yeah, he is. He's an absolute hero. And the guilt started to come back. And I remember rolling up my window. I got the directions, and I drove to the cemetery. And I parked my car. There was no one else there. It's November 11th. It was cold. It was probably about 0 degrees, and there was a rain-snow mix that was falling. And I walked through that cemetery, up and down the rows, and then all of a sudden I saw his tombstone. And I remember I just started crying. I started crying initially, like right away, just like that. The tears started. I went back to my car. And I grabbed some beer that I had in my trunk, and I brought it back out to his headstone, and I stood in front of that headstone, and I told him, I said, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry that you had to go when you did. And just the guilt came back, the emotions came back, and I was standing there with this beer, and I remember sitting down. I had brought one of my jackets from my car to sit on because the ground was wet, and I remember sitting there beside his headstone. I had my hand on his headstone, and I was drinking this beer, and I left the empties beside his tombstone because those were the beers I was going to buy him in Dubai. And I was just ridden with guilt. And I remember looking up. I don't know what possessed me to look up, but I just happened to look up just at this time. I looked up at the road, and I saw this CTV news truck. And I thought, oh God, that's not good. Somebody must have told the news that I was here, and they were looking for me. Here I am. I'm in my dress uniform. I've got open liquor. It's not a good look. And if I'm ever caught on the news, my superiors, what are they going to say if they see this? So I was hiding in behind the tombstone. I didn't want them to see me. And eventually they did slow down by the cemetery, but they didn't see me. I don't think they saw me. So they carried on. But I remember thinking there's no way that my bosses can see, you know, a man standing or sitting by this tombstone with open liquor drinking. And obviously I knew I couldn't drink more than one because I had to drive back to Ottawa. And but having that time at his tombstone was incredibly helpful for me, because part of it was closure for me, because I didn't get a chance to say goodbye. I didn't get a chance to attend his funeral back in Ontario and the service that they had for him in Edmonton. I remember leaving I drank one beer and I poured the others out, but I left a couple bottles by his tombstone, and I got down on one knee and I put my hands on his tombstone and I said, please forgive me. Yeah. Please forgive me. Now I've got to live with this guilt, and it's not fun. When I reflect back, not once did I ever consider suicide. I never considered suicide, but I was depressed. There were days I got up and I didn't want to get out of bed. I was emotionally wrecked. Now, at the same time that all this was going on, I was still going through therapy. I owed it to my wife to stay strong and to be strong for her. Our daughter was born in December of 2003. So now I'm a dad. I need to be strong for my child. And not once did I consider suicide, because I didn't want my daughter to grow up. If I had committed suicide, I didn't want my daughter to grow up and think, oh yeah, I never really got a chance to see my dad or meet my dad because my dad was a coward and he killed himself. Yeah. I didn't want her to think that I was being selfish. So I didn't think of suicide, but I was depressed. I was absolutely depressed, and I couldn't be in a crowd. I couldn't be placed in a crowd because it would just drive me nuts. I needed to get out of there. So that part was real. So when I got back from Lancaster that one day, and I regret not taking a picture when I was by his tombstone, but I had my closure at his gravesite, and I must have cried. I must have cried for an hour, and I was freezing cold. I was wet, but Mark was never coming home. So I can be tired and wet and cold because he can't feel that. So I went home, and then over the course of weeks and months to follow, I was able to meet Mark's parents. And that was another piece of closure I had. I went to Mark's parents' house, and I reached out to them, and they invited me to their home. And I got a chance to meet his mom and his dad. And when I walked into their home, they had pictures of Mark everywhere. And I gave his parents a big hug, and I told them, I said, your son died a hero in my eyes. He did nothing wrong. And I told them what had happened. I told them that he volunteered to go. I told them that now I have to live with this. I don't like living with this. This is awful. I don't wish this on my worst enemy. This is awful. But his parents were very forgiving. His parents were forgiving. His parents, told me that they don't blame me. They didn't blame me. And his parents were religious people. And his parents had said that, you know what, it was just Mark's time to go. Mark, the last thing he did on this earth was he sacrificed himself for someone else. And for that, I'll be eternally grateful. But it wasn't easy. And obviously, it still affects me today. This is something you just don't turn off in your head. This is real. I'm extremely proud that I don't live with the symptoms of post-traumatic stress today because of the urging of my wife to go get some help and to go try and get better, because I owed it to my daughter, I owed it to my wife, and I owed it to my family.
I'm really glad you did, and I'm sure the type of man that Mark was, he'd be proud of you today, just from hearing about the story.
Mark was just a genuine good man, and he would give the shirt off his back to help you, as would Nathan and Richard and Ainsworth. And you know, when people die, people say, "Oh yeah, he was such a great guy." Meanwhile, you know, he may not necessarily have been a good man. And sometimes we say that about the fallen because we don't want to speak ill will of the dead. But those 4 men were just genuinely strong, good-natured guys who put others ahead of themselves. And that's the role of an infantry paratrooper, is you put people ahead and you give yourself last. Because it's always mission before self. That's what you're always taught. And I was taught that from the time I was 18 years old. Mission before self. You think of yourself last, but you put everybody first. And that's what Mark did. And because of that, Mark unfortunately is no longer with us. And it's a part of my life that was very dark, but I managed to make it through. And I'm just grateful.
Even our strongest need help. And just for everyone, please, if you need help, please reach out. And I just wrote a closing statement here. It's a true honor to have you here, Craig. I really appreciate you sharing with me and the listeners today. I just want to extend my deepest sincere thank you to us for joining us and your decades of service to the Canadian military. And also, and your career as a warrant officer, and this second lease of life that you got, just supporting your daughter and being a family man. And just to honor the memory of Mark, is it Leger? Leger. Corporal Ainsworth Dyer, Private Richard Green, Private Nathan Smith. Their memory can live on through all of us, and the heroes that they were. Their service that they served our country, they're heroes, and honestly grateful for them and all the fallen troops that were in overseas.
Yeah, it's the one thing that even to this day on April 17th is I drive to Rundle Park to the Ainsworth Dyer Bridge. They built that bridge in memory of Ainsworth, and Ainsworth used to run across that bridge when he was training for mountain man competitions. And he actually proposed to his fiancée on that bridge before we went overseas. So it was an old, decrepit, rickety bridge. They tore it down and they rebuilt it, and they call it the Ainsworth Dyer Bridge. And I go there every April 17th and November 11th. And November 11th for a veteran is obviously a very tough day. I mean, it's a tough day because we always want to remember the sacrifices of the fallen. But when you're a veteran, Remembrance Day is every day. We think of our veterans every single day. There are certain things that I'll see in my day-to-day life today that will instantly, I'll remember Mark, or I'll remember this was something that Richard Green said. And Remembrance Day is every day for a veteran, especially a combat veteran who has been in combat and has experienced those things overseas. And unfortunately, the Army doesn't train you to deal with that. It doesn't train you to deal with the loss of a comrade, or dealing with the loss of one of your troops after an improvised explosive device goes off. The Army doesn't train you to deal with that. You've got to deal with that on your own. And I'd like to think now, I'm urging anyone who might be hurting, there is absolutely no shame in reaching out. I'm glad I reached out, because I don't know where I'd be today if I hadn't. And I'm extremely grateful to my family. I'm grateful to be alive. But if there are veterans out there, or if there's anyone, you don't have to be a veteran to be hurting. Anybody can be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, and no one is immune to post-traumatic stress. And I urge, please make that phone call if you're hurting. There's no shame. Absolutely no shame in hurting. It's okay to not be okay. It absolutely is. Yes, I admit the stigma maybe 20, 25 years ago, probably wasn't what it is now. But I've lost a fair amount of guys over the years who have committed suicide, who were dealing with demons overseas, came home and either didn't know how to deal with it, or maybe it was just too much for them to deal with. And unfortunately, there's a lot of guys I served with who are no longer with us because they were dealing with those demons. I had demons that were more survival guilt-ridden demons, but they were still demons nonetheless. So I urge anyone who might be hurting or who might think maybe I need help, but I'm not sure if I need help. Mental health is extremely important in today's society, and I urge anyone who might be hurting to please reach out. There's no shame in reaching out.
There is not. And thank you everyone for listening today. Thank you for being here, Craig. I actually have some different services that I've written down here. There'd be TELUS Health, Veterans Affairs Canada, peer support, operational stress, injury, social support, and the Royal Canadian Legion. And thank you everybody for listening to Prime Joe Time on Spare Bedroom Studios. Like, subscribe, and please support our veterans and make sure you buy poppies. Have a good day. Thanks, Craig. Thank you for your story.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
I appreciate it.